Welcome back, and let's continue to our second last poem of the series of 10. We're going to go straight into now Momentos 1 by William DeWitt Snodgrass. It's a very unusual name, that I must admit. And I notice also that it's called Momentos 1. Was there a Momentos 2 as a poem? I don't really know. This poem, of course, is extremely well done, but it is a little bit depressing because it describes the destruction of what had originally been a fantastic relationship. Bear with me while we read through it together. And we've got this here. Sorting out letters and piles of my old cancelled checks, old clippings, and yellow note cards that meant something once, I happened to find your picture. That picture. I stopped there cold, like a man raking piles of dead leaves in his yard who has turned up a severed hand. Still, that first second, I was glad. You stand just as you stood, shy, delicate, slender, in that long gown of green lace netting and daisies that you wore to our first dance. The sight of you stunned us all. Well, our needs were different then, and our ideals came easy. Then through the war and those 2 long years overseas, the Japanese dead in their shacks among dishes, dolls, and lost shoes, I carried that glimpse of you there to choke down my fear, prove it had been, that it might come back. That was before we got married. Before we drained out one another's force with lives, self-denial, unspoken regret, and the sick eyes that blame. Before the divorce and the treachery. Say it, before we met. Still, I put back your picture. Someday, in due course, I will find that it's still there. Wow, deeply moving. Let's take a look at this in some detail then. Who then was William DeWitt Snodgrass? And it says here, Snodgrass is an American poet, lecturer, and editor who fought against the Japanese in the Second World War, as you can see from that poem. But he was very active in the literary world, both academically and practically. The poem was probably written sometime during the 1960s. Obviously, that would have given him enough time to get married and to divorce, etc., because World War II ended in 1945. Funnily enough, we're in that interesting period in history. I should mention this quickly. We are now in the 11th of August, and the atomic bombs were dropped respectively on the 6th and the 9th of August. The war ended on the 15th of August, 1945. That would have been when Snodgrass heard that he's going home. The war's finished. Now they just wait for the troop ships to take them back, and pretty soon then he got married, etc., and that gave rise to eventually the divorce and the poem that we are reading today. And the poet was probably deeply moved by finding a picture of his former wife. These things happen. All of us have got pictures and souvenirs and mementos packed away somewhere of other people. For me, obviously, photos are the most common. I've got them stretching back to the time I was born, and from before then, I've got my parents' photos as well. They mean a lot to me. Those are irreplaceable mementos. The theme, even our bad memories are valuable to us. The worst memories can eventually become good because over the course of time, we look back and we say, okay, that was bad, but it wasn't all bad. We had a good time at times. And here, a second theme that I've included: people change according to time and place. What you thought, what you believed, your political beliefs, etc., that you held 40 years ago, if, like me, you were already very much alive then, will by now have changed completely. They do change as we grow up, and we realize that politicians are trying to trick us so that they can get our votes, and we tend to become very sarcastic and cynical about that aspect of life. But it happens. The form. 4 stanzas of 6 lines each, with frequent enjambment to show us that we are sharing the poet's thoughts. That's the function of the enjambment here. It's very informal. You can almost hear the words churning around in the poet's mind, and as he's putting them down onto paper. And the diction is very uncomplicated. There are few words there, if any, that are not common, everyday words. The tone, I've put only one word for the tone here. It's nostalgic. But I also wanted to put wistful. All of us look back and we say, but what would have happened if I didn't marry that person? What would have happened if, in those days I had chosen a different career? We all do that. It's normal human nature. But everything, of course, comes down to the present and the fact that these are the choices we made. Now life is what we make of it. Carrying on. Rhyme. You'll see some rhyme is used, but it's not always accurate rhyme. And then, of course, the rhythm. The poem is frequently paused. Oh, I almost said here, the poem is piquantly paused. That would have come out really fantastically. The poem is frequently paused, reflecting the rambling thoughts of the narrator. The thoughts are not well guided. They are random thoughts flashing around all over the place inside his head. Imagery. Now, this is an unusual poem in that it has very few items of figurative speech. It's extremely literal. I've put that there. After the simile in the first stanza, most of the poem is starkly literal language, starkly naked. It's literal. He's just saying, that's what's there. Let's take one more look at the text of the poem before we move on to our final one for the day. And it says here, what's he doing in the beginning? It's boring stuff. It is of no interest to us until the event happens. He finds that photograph. Sorting out letters and piles of my old cancelled checks, old clippings, that's newspaper clippings, and yellow note cards that meant something once. Now, obviously, they mean nothing, and he's going to throw most of this away. I happened to find your picture. And now suddenly, an event. That meant your picture, that picture. I stopped there cold. And now you've got the simile, which is not very pleasant. Like a man raking piles of dead leaves in his yard who has turned up a severed hand. Could this be, he's saying, that he lost his right-hand person when they were divorced? I don't know. Still, that first second, I was glad. You stand just as you stood, shy, delicate, slender, in that long gown of green lace netting and daisies that you wore to our first dance. The sight of you stunned us all. Well, our needs were different then, and our ideals came easy. You notice the typical Americanism there. It should, to be fully grammatically correct, our ideals came easily. Otherwise, what he's done here is to use an adjective instead of an adverb. But this makes it more natural. That is, in fact, how people speak. People do not pay wonderful attention to perfect diction, and that's an example of it. Then through the war and those 2 long years overseas, the Japanese dead in their shacks among dishes, dolls, and lost shoes, I carried that glimpse of you there to choke down my fear, prove that it had been, that it might come back. That was before we got married, before we drained out one another's forces with lies, self-denial, unspoken regret, and the sick eyes that blame. Before the divorce and the treachery, say it, before we met. He's being very honest here, and he's not blaming her. He's giving himself an equal share of the blame. It's always we. Still, I put back your picture. Someday, in due course, I will find that it's still there. It's never going to go away. It's going to be there as this private memento for the rest of his life.